Okay, so I watched this fascinating interview with Ben Shapiro interviewing Michael Waltz. Now, Michael Waltz is going to be the new Jake Sullivan for the Trump administration. Unlike Sullivan, who's a lawyer, Waltz was a Green Beret. And they have very different issues. So they have very different perspectives about how things work. Okay, so first you're going to hear him talking about why, and I keep talking about Syria, right? And what's going on in Syria and the Middle East. Here he's explaining that, and then we're going to look at how he deals with the issue of Ukraine. And it's not everything that I was hoping it would be, but it's a whole lot better than what we've been slow walking to Ukraine, in my estimation. Here we go, this talking about the Middle East first and Syria.
Why do, my supporters in Northeast St. Johns County in Florida, why does this matter to them and their everyday lives, right? Well, number one, if Iran gets a nuke, the Saudis are going to want a nuke, the Turks are going to want a nuke. If the Middle East exploding, not literally, but figuratively, in a nuclear arms race should scare every American.
Yeah, and that's the lesson from the war in Ukraine, is that if there is a country that doesn't have nukes that's being invaded by a country with nukes, well, then everybody else is going, if I had nukes, they wouldn't have done this, and that could be problematic.
This isn't World War III with them flying between the United States and the Soviet Union. But if you ever have nukes going regionally, that is catastrophic for the world. Number two, Israel is our critical ally, both morally, historically, and I think geopolitically. And we should believe an Ayatollah who intends to wipe Israel off the face of the earth if they have nukes. And then number three, we can't take our eye off the ball of ISIS and terrorism. And with the withdrawal...
Okay, let's talk about the Ayatollah first. So when he's talking about the Ayatollah, Trump hates Iran. I mean, just hates Iran. Okay, let's keep going.
All from Afghanistan that now is essentially Osama bin Laden's dream, and we haven't even talked about what's simmering over there. What happens over there will not stay over there, but to have another ISIS caliphate that we have to clean up again. I mean, those are all our critical national interests. And
now let's fast forward and look at his position on Ukraine.
So, I mean, no, that's exactly right. And the world has gotten really small. I mean, the fact is that, for example, Iran losing its financial capability, that's going to have a heavy impact on what happens in places like Ukraine, because actually it's Iranian drones that are being used by the Russians in Ukraine. Yep. And Russia, of course, was involved in the Middle East, and Russia is involved in Europe, and Russia has a burgeoning relationship with China. And all of these issues are interconnected, and trying to sort of separate off regions of the world. There are some regions of the world that don't have major impacts on the rest of the world. I mean, frankly, large portions of Africa. But the reality is that if you're looking at the Middle East, which again has many thoroughfares for shipping, or is the supply of oil for many of America's adversaries, or is the supply of tech, right, and allies, or is this a source of a lot of military tech? I mean, a lot of the military tech that America uses is actually developed in Israel as add-ons to, for example,
the amount of Chinese money going to Tehran, buying their oil for cents on the dollar, and then the drones flying into Russia and the missiles going into Russia that we're then spending against in Ukraine, and the terrorism that's exploded across the Middle East. I mean, one could argue it's our money with our trade deficit going into China, going into Iran, then flowing into Russia in the Middle East. So it's one of the reasons the president is so focused on these trade deficits, because it's really, in many ways, our money from our market that's flowing around the world, and then often our adversaries are using against us, that we then have to spend against in our own defense budget. So it's almost a double counting.
So it's an interesting perspective, and he's going to talk more about Ukraine. It's not everything I hoped it would be. It's not just like full-throated support like I would like it to be, but it's not bad, all things being considered.
Let's talk about Russia, because Russia, obviously, that was the other pillar that Assad was standing on. That got destroyed largely because of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine continues to fight on. The Biden administration's approach to the war in Ukraine has been at best ambivalent. It's been bizarrely vague. From the very beginning of the war, when Joe Biden's first response was, "Can we get you a plane for Zelensky to get out of Ukraine?" to, "You are going to be able to fight as long as you want for whatever ends you want, but we're not going to define the ends, but also we're not going to give you the weaponry to actually allow you to achieve the end."
Yeah, literally said, "We're not going to define it. It's up to them."
Right.
And I think we have
it's bizarre.
An inherent interest in how that ends.
For sure.
It's in our interest.
And not only that, even if you're going to do that, if you're going to say to Zelensky, however you want it to end, that's how it should end, And then he says, okay, then I need these resources. Well, if A, then B. If he wants the end to be liberating the Donbass and Crimea, then you have to give him the weaponry to do that, or just admit that that's actually not in the United States' interest to provide that weaponry, and that's not what the end of the war is going to look like.
Yeah.
And the Biden administration refused sort of both sides of that bargain.
Even behind closed doors, in compartmented facilities, or even publicly, you can never get that answer. As we were really having that last funding debate,
Now, why couldn't they get that answer? Because the Biden administration was simultaneously saying, we're supporting everything. And while they're doing that, they're also going to not try to provoke Putin. We don't want to escalate. And so I think that's part of the mixed messaging that I don't think is a problem for the Trump administration, but they're coming with other problems of not wanting to be involved, but having to clean up this mess that they don't want to fester. So, okay, let's hear a little bit more.
There were a number of Republicans who had been, got to stop Putin, can't let him roll through Ukraine and hit NATO and then suck us in that way, and wanted to vote for it, but said you refuse to define what the end state is in line with our interests. You refuse to define the strategy to achieve that end state, and then what resources that are needed for that strategy. In the military, it's ends, ways, and means, right? The goal, the strategy to achieve the goal, and the resources needed for the strategy.
And that is the strategic thinking. So thinking through that and being very candid and clear about that would have been a better step for the Biden administration, which lost an opportunity to clearly explain why this is so critically important and how we're going to get there. I know some will say, well, they have laid out a strategy, but it's really not been communicated to the point where the public is going, oh, yeah. I mean, full on public, not just those that were already sympathetic, but to understand why this is so critical.
All they just wanted to talk about was more money.
Right.
And stop asking us these annoying questions like, where is this all going? And I do think it's a valid question. I certainly get asked by my constituents, is it in America's national interest to expect every Russian off of every inch of Ukraine, including Crimea? How long is that going to take? How much money is that going to cost? How many lives will be lost? Is that even a realistic goal at this point? Valid question, something we're certainly talking about. It's really now, the president's been very clear the war's got to end. What's been interesting is to see all of the shifts.
Okay, now that question, he didn't say no. They're talking about it. President Trump has been saying the war has to end, but how it ends is what's important, not that it ends. So just keep listening.
With European leaders, Ukrainians, everyone now adopting that framework. So part of my job and our job with the team he's put together is who's at the table, how do we get people to the table, and then what's the framework for an agreement that best meets our interests.
Well, one of the things that's been fascinating about President Trump's approach to this is that he actually has not taken the sort of more isolationist position that all funding will definitely go away no matter what. Right? The one thing that President Trump is very clear about is that he doesn't like losing. And
okay, so he hasn't said everything's going to dry up, right? We were afraid of that before the election, and he know that he doesn't want to lose. And Shapiro's about to make a brilliant point.
The definition of losing would be Russian tanks rolling through Kyiv. And so
Let me replay that.
No matter again. Right? The one thing that President Trump is very clear about is that he doesn't like losing. And one definition of losing would be Russian tanks rolling through Kyiv. And so, that what he's doing, as he's stated openly with regard to NATO, for example, is he's getting everybody else to pay their freight. He says, okay, well, if you want to make sure that NATO actually does its job, then all you other nations have to increase your defense spending, and you have to be contributing more to the fight in Ukraine. And meanwhile, he understands that if all leverage disappears against Putin, he's going to get a bad deal. This is one thing that President Trump understands probably better than anyone in American politics.
Anybody I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, he understands leverage, and he understands that if the leverage were to go away against Putin, then he's not going to get a good deal. So he needs enough leverage to get Putin to the table. But also, obviously, the United States has tremendous leverage on Zelensky and Ukraine to also come to the table. And so it seems to me that this has been the case for several years.
What I just want to kind of foot stomp here is we've seen everybody's narrative go from as long as it tanks, blank check, don't dare say anything else, or you're somehow pro-Russian, to how do we get this to a deal? How do we get this to it? Just from the Trump effect, right? Yes, since he was elected. We saw that in Paris when he just went over. We've seen that from everybody who's come to see it. One of the first.
And that sounds terrible in one way, that it's changed from as long as it takes to let's make a deal. But the as long as it takes wasn't really working. When they're so worried about escalating that as long as it takes didn't mean we'll give you everything that you need so that you can actually win, then maybe this path will actually work. I don't know. But what the previous administration did wasn't really working out so well.
People that we had at Mar-a-Lago was the NATO Secretary General, and that's where he was. But I think the broader pieces that have been also missing are energy policy. We we start flooding the world with, by the way, cleaner American oil and gas, and you're driving down prices. Now you're taking options away from Iran, Russia, Venezuela, our other adversaries. And oh, by
Right, because more oil with drill baby drill means cheaper oil prices everywhere, and that's going to hurt Putin.
the way, people should be buying from us, not them. I had lunch with the Speaker of the Parliament of Lithuania right there on the front line. She said, I buy 85% of my gas from Louisiana and Texas. You now have an LNG ban. What do you want me to do? Right? I mean, you're leaving me no option. It was a bit insane. So better energy policy, better sanctions enforcement, and burden sharing from our NATO allies are just pieces that have been absolutely missing. It's gotten better with NATO, but it's like patting an F student on the head for getting a D. I mean, they should have been at 100% back in 2014, the first time Russia invaded, when they pledged to do it. And now, for example, Canada is on track to achieve the minimum by 2032. It's completely unacceptable. We should be
Okay. So for all those reasons, I'm optimistic that Michael Waltz, the Green Beret, understands a lot more than what Jake Sullivan did, or at least he's not going to be deterred by Putin's saber rattling. Are you more encouraged or are you more discouraged after seeing Michael Waltz? Put that in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.